Carlos Juarez, thank you so much for joining us on this very important news story. I think we have to know about it. I think it does affect the United States, and it has, an echo chamber with what is going on, what has gone on in Washington, because some people say our insurrection is not quite over. Our insurrection took place last week in the election of Kevin McCarthy. And so, insurrections are all the rage these days, aren't they? Tell us what happened in Brazil.
Well, welcome, Jay. Always a pleasure, and delighted to reconnect with you. And in this case, put on my Latin Americanist hat, as a longtime observer and longtime resident as well, and specialist in the region. And it does matter, as you mentioned. I mean, Brazil is, of course, a very important player regionally, of course, the largest Latin American country, population, economy, but it is a global leader as well, as you well know, part of the BRICS years ago, together with Russia, India, China, and so on. And it was particularly at that time, about 10 years ago, under the new, now returning President Lula, that Brazil sort of was very prominent. Well, what happened in this last weekend, quite dramatic. We saw massive crowds in Brasilia, the capital, walking up to the ramps of the congressional buildings, taking over the House of Congress chambers, the Supreme Court. I mean, just ghastly and a lot of destruction. And of course, very much parallels what we saw literally 2 years ago in Washington, D.C. That is, it is as a result of the outcome of a recent election Brazil held at the end of October. And those basically protesting our supporters, hardcore supporters of the ex-president, the outgoing president, who did not win re-election. So it got ugly. It's still a work in progress, and comes curiously at a time when our own president, Joe Biden, happens to be in Latin America, a very rare first-time opportunity. He's traveled now to Mexico City, meeting with the Mexican president, AMLO, and Canada's prime minister. They're having a trilateral meeting, very important. And so interesting, all three of them issued a very important statement condemning the violence, supporting the president, and so on. But, the issue is complex. It has a lot of interesting parallels on the one hand, some interesting differences, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out and how whether, the response of the Brazilian government, this new incoming government, is going to be quick, decisive, but it also underscores we see a very polarized society in Brazil, very much. This outgoing president, a right-wing, leader who very much had ties to the military, himself a military leader. Keep in mind, Brazil has a very important military in its past history, a political military. That is, they ran the country from, the late 60s through the mid 80s for about 20 years as a military regime. So when we speak of the military in Brazil, it's not just abstract. I mean, it's and in people's mind, there are both memories of it and even today, fears of what would the military, support him or not. So far, it looks as if they have not, although clearly there are allies and supporters. Moreover, this could not have happened without some pretty clear, support and, let's say, acquiescence from a lot of security forces, intelligence agencies as well. So it's a complex mess, but boy, we're looking at it unravel. And again, the parallels with the U.S. and what happened here 2 years ago, the insurrection, as you noted, of our own capital. Is this something that's going to now become the new norm in fledgling democracies? Interesting topics, but yeah, and I'm struck also with, we real quick thought is that, for the U.S., we saw this as clearly what it was, a very blight to our democracy, long heralded as the beacon of democracy. Now the U.S. is wounded from that, and the world sees that. What I want to suggest is that Brazil, it remains to be seen, but it is a fledgling democracy. It's, it doesn't have, let's say, the long record of the U.S., so it is, on one hand, a little bit more tenuous, but I want to suggest that it's very possible that the institutions will prevail, and then Brazil may come out of this even stronger. And in a paradox, in that sense, that a weaker, maybe newer democracy gets challenged, maybe it will prove something that can strengthen it. Again, I'm just speculating there. Whereas for the U.S., I think we're still figuring out, what the result is of our own insurrection, and even the drama that played out last week. Some would say it's democracy, which is messy, but others would say it's also, at the end, it's not really about policy. It's just this petty, ugly, personality-driven polarization, let's say.
I don't know enough about this, but maybe you can help me. So in this country, it was all based on, the election was stolen. Trump's big lie. And so that was sort of a justification, a rationale of, a lot of people who were at the insurrection and who otherwise take the position that the election was stolen in so many ways. Query, what was the rationalization, if any, for the attack on the government in Brasilia. Was it similar? Was it something like the election was stolen? Some kind of euphemistic rationalization?
I mean, definitely very much similar, and in the sense that it followed many months of very incendiary remarks from Bolsonaro. That is, the election occurred at the end of October. Even leading up to it, like Trump, he was already, addressing, fake news and questioning the legitimacy of either rigged, elections and the like. So some of it is definitely that, and that makes very clear a comparison. That is, both leaders employed very similar playbooks here. During and after the electoral defeats, leading to concerns in both countries about how robust the electoral processes and the democratic institutions would hold up. So again, Bolsonaro complained vehemently about fake news, insisting that the polling that was used was rigged, etc. Trump himself, interesting about the insurrection, again, some parallels and differences. Trump basically spoke directly to his supporters hours before, we recall, and we've heard a lot of that evidence, and then he remained in his residence. Interestingly, Bolsonaro, of course, is gone. He left shortly before the inauguration to Florida, and he's been in the United States. So very curious how, in some ways, that gives him almost like a plausible, well, I wasn't there, I wasn't behind it, and yet, the other part is like, will he be, extradited back if the Brazilian government chooses to, push forward, and as they could, he's facing a lot of, similar to Trump, a lot of different court, issue. Not court, I'm sorry. He's basically being investigated for at least 4 different criminal probes himself. All 4 of these investigations are led by the Supreme Court justice, who's had a prominent role in this crisis right now, and of course, who Bolsonaro's critics are saying is trying to silence free speech. So it's an ugly debate going back and forth. But the point is, even his presence in the U.S. now, for some, it might be seen as a way to try to get away from it or what, and yet, he could also see fresh investigations that are following because he's no longer a president. He doesn't have the protections of a sitting president, and the U.S. Could extradite him if it was presented. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, I really take your point about deniability. I mean, it's like he learned from the select committee in this country. He learned not to be around, not to be directly involved, be in Florida. Where you can say, "Gee, I didn't have anything to do with this."
It's
a great defense.